Supposed to be, because we're running well behind, the common man, leadership of the common man. What do normal individuals bring? And we're going to sneak in everyone's favorite Maverick General, George Patton, at the same time. So these are kind of in the Civil War class and coming up in World War II. I read a lot of diaries. I think that's the way you really get to see the mind of a person. Like, what are they really thinking and feeling, and the emotion and the anger to the tiredness. And so Elijah Hunt Rhodes back there, the collage, this young man right here, I was getting worried. I'm like, oh, that's all right. And a guy from Sam Watkins in the Civil War, and then Eugene Sledge and Robert Leckie from World War II. I've read their diaries 100 times. Thomas Shinn's, U.S. Grant's, Patton's, and the legendary Dick Winters. And so, you know, you have these big iconic personalities like Patton, which we're going to talk about, but it's always kind of the normal average, what I call him average everyday Joe, that makes the big difference. And so the two of the more famous, Chamberlain, you know, you guys have heard of Joshua Chamberlain? Yeah. A couple of people, all right.
You covered he's Civil War.
Civil War. And then what he does, he's one of those guys who's great during the Civil War, and in later life is just kind of very influential but sad. Like, you know, and kind of hangs on to, like the old Al Bundy, like he says the greatest day of his life was July 2nd, 1863. So, and then this guy, I was fortunate enough to meet, Dick Winters, the Vander Brothers guy. He was just an incredible individual. I do want to correct an error if you stuck around last week. I hate to give out erroneous information. President Truman fired Douglas MacArthur, but the hatchet man who had to deliver the message was Eisenhower. So I was corrected last week, and I'm like, oh man. Of course, you clearly knew that. But,
yes, we were all talking about that.
Yeah. And so I was like, oh man, oh boy, everything I'm a moron now. So anyway, which is totally true. George Patton, interesting guy, kind of very colorful guy. Many of you may have seen the old George C. Scott movie, which is the great representation. That movie was based off the diary of Omar Bradley, who was actually a consultant on the film. So a lot of that stuff is very accurate, and I think George C. Scott did a great job. But Patton is born, interestingly enough, on November 11th, 1885. His family were very wealthy Virginia blue bloods. His dad, or grandfather, fought with in the Revolution with Robert E. Lee's dad. Family members were involved in the Civil War. His dad dies, and his mom marries his uncle. Kind of weird. And then they move out to Pasadena, California, where Patton grows up very wealthy on a giant 2,000-acre ranch outside Los Angeles, and lives kind of just a really charmed childhood. And his babysitter was old Colonel Mosby, one of Jeb Stuart's top hands in the cavalry, and he can ride and shoot a gun and fight with a sword by the age of 10. But what George doesn't do is a lot of schoolwork. He's homeschooled until he's about 11. He doesn't like it, you know, he likes to hear stories and act out tales. And then when he turns 11, all of a sudden he starts reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. And when he hits those, bam, he's hooked. These, you know, Odysseus and Achilles and Hector, this is the stuff. And that hooks him on history and military history. At the age of 17, he decides he's going to shoot big, and he's going to go to West Point. That's his plan. But he doesn't have the mathematical grades to get anywhere close to it. So using family connections and working very hard, he's admitted into VMI, Virginia Military Institute. He's told that if he works really hard after 2 years, he can reapply to West Point. He finally makes it, and the story is pretty interesting. At VMI at the time, cadets were stationed with older officers, and George happened to be stuck with the heavyweight boxing champion of VMI. Well, Patton was a tall guy, about 6'1", 6'2", very, very skinny. And he gets to VMI and it's hot. It's like Virginia heat in the late summer, early fall. And he gets up and he opens the window. And his roommate, who was the officer, said, "Excuse me, cadet, you didn't ask permission. I'm cold. I want the window shut." Patton's like, "No, I'm not going to do it." So the guy gets up and he slams the window shut. And Patton says he knows they were both sweating. Patton waits a few minutes and he gets up and he opens the window again. The guy's like, "God bless it, Patton. I'm telling you, you do that again, I'm going to kick your tail." Gets up and he shuts the window. A few seconds later, Patton gets up and he opens the window and he turns, and his roommate was there and just drops him with one punch. And he said before he knew it, this scrawny kid, Patton, jumped up and attacked him like a wildcat. They get into this wild brawl in their dorm room. Now, Patton clearly loses, but the next day, this heavyweight boxing champion has a broken nose, one eye is swelled shut, and had bruises and cuts all over him. And he said the one thing about Patton is he just wouldn't quit. No matter what I did to him, no matter how hard I hit him, he kept getting back up. And so that kind of shows what Patton's tenacity is throughout his life. He's one of those guys who just never backed off. He finally gets into West Point, where he excels and does well in everything except mathematics. Apparently, he had a really difficult stat class, and it really made him work as hard as he possibly could. So you're not the only one there. But anyway, so here's young, good-looking George. And one of the things he excelled in was sword fighting, pistol shooting, rifle shooting, and riding. And all of those things get his attention, and he was selected to represent the United States excuse me, in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics. And while everyone else is lazing around on board, eating the good food, taking it easy, there was this crazy man who was running around the deck, doing deep knee bends, jumping jacks. He hired a guy to throw rubber balls in the ocean, and he would wade in the back and shoot at them with his pistol on the crossing over, because Patton was psychotically competitive, and he hates to lose. While there, yes ma'am?
What were his events?
He was in the pentathlon, which was running, swimming, a steeplechase, fencing, and pistol shooting. And so he's doing extremely well. And there is all of a sudden some controversy where most people shot a .22 at these targets. And for whatever reason, it's 1912, they used the same target. Well, Patton shot a higher caliber .38. And he was winning it was the third and final round of shooting, and he was bang, 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 clear out in front. But they said he missed his sixth shot entirely. He's like, "What are you talking about? I fired 18 shots, I don't miss." And what he said was that his sixth bullet kind of Robin Hooded his fifth bullet. Look, the hole is so big, I bet if you dig, there are 2 bullets in there. They wouldn't do it, the judge overruled, and Patton drops, and he's angry. Turns out later on, they dig through the wooden backstop and they find 2 bullets. So he was correct. He does well in fencing, but he was all aggressive. He had no defense. He would just, thrust, 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 and if he won, he won. If he lost, he lost. And they're like, "Patton, you need skill." And he's like, "Who needs skill? If I attack and win, why defend anything?" And so finally it comes to the steeplechase, where he is pretty much, unless catastrophe happens, he's going to win a medal. And at this time, you didn't get to use your own horse in the steeplechase. You just picked one out of the pool and took off. Pretty much all he has to do is finish. And he starts the course, and people are waiting and waiting and waiting, and there's no Patton. They're waiting, and there's no Patton. About halfway through, his horse stopped in front of one of the barriers. He falls into it and breaks his right shoulder. He's knocked out for a little bit. He gets up, takes off his belt, and makes a sling. Now, how he did this, I don't know. Finally, they come in looking for him, like, "Well, Patton, you're going to drop out." He's like, "Oh, no, I'm going to finish the race." And he finished with the broken clavicle, gets across the finish line, pretty much passes out and taken to the hospital, but he doesn't get a medal. He loses. And he said, you know, normally I would be upset, but to represent the country and be around all those great athletes was honor enough. Not true. He was mad until his dying day. He was really bitter. When he gets home, he is sent to what is Fort Bliss down in Texas, where he talks his way into going after Mexican bandit Pancho Villa. And the problem is, Patton is this rich kid, right? His family was wealthy. And so when the other officers are living in like tar paper shacks, Patton buys a house for him and his wife. He has 7 or 8 of his horses from California shipped to where he is. So there's the officers and the enlisted men, and Patton is off doing his own thing. So nobody really likes him because he really doesn't need the money. It's just what he chose for his career. And so he goes to General John Pershing and says, hey, General, George Patton, I'm Olympics. I'm going to go down there to Mexico with you. Get away from me, kid. Just shut up. You're that rich kid that nobody likes. And Patton kept showing up. Outside of Pershing's house in the morning, Patton will be standing at attention. Request permission to go to Mexico with you, sir. No, kid, go away. And he would stand outside his office in the evening. And finally, he's like, Patton, stay away from me. If I see you again, you're done. But Pershing, who was a very difficult man to get along with, his family, when he was stationed in Missouri, he's down in Texas, their house burns down. And his wife and children all are trapped in the house. So by this point in his career, he's understandably angry, but he's getting bitter. He's not a guy you want to provoke. But he decides to check on this Patton character. He's like, if he is always waiting for me, is he doing his duties? How are his men trained? How is his area policed? And Pershing finds out that Patton soldiers, everything's squared away, everything's done about as perfect as it can. He got up early, he stayed up late to make sure his job was done, and then he wears down Pershing. And finally, Pershing, as he's standing out there at 4 o'clock in the morning, Pershing would alternate his times to try and on purposely avoid Patton, but he couldn't. He's like, fine, you can go as an observer. Shut your mouth, don't ask me for anything else, this is what you are going to do. And as they go down to Mexico, clearly they can't find Pancho Villa, and they take with them 3 Dodge touring cars. And they hear that up in this little, fort up on this mountaintop, that there is a couple of Pancho Villa's lieutenants, and someone needs to take the cars up there and do a reconnaissance. Well, Patton volunteers. And they drive up there, and when he graduated from West Point, he bought for himself a 44 caliber Smith & Wesson, like John Wayne cowboy gun with ivory handles that he put his name in 24 karat gold in, and he wore it on his hip like a cowboy. And as they get up to the hacienda, he knocks on the door and talks to the young lady. Hey, Pancho Villa's guys here. She's like, no. But she was very nervous, and he had 2 of the other guys with him stationed on the roof of this barn. And all of a sudden, 3 of Pancho Villa guys come out. One of them shot at Patton. He draws, shoots him twice, gets that one. Another one ran from the house to the barn. He shoots and got that one. The third one is on a horse, trying to run him down, and he fires 2 more shots, and he shoots all 3 of them. Ties them to the bumpers of the car like deer, drives them down to Pershing and says, look what I got. And Pershing's like, I told you to interrogate him, not to kill him. And he's like, well, they were shooting at me. I didn't know what to do. And he asked the other guys, did this guy Patton shoot all of them? And they're like, well, yeah, he did. So Pershing's like, well, God, I hate this kid, but I really kind of have to like him. So he puts Patton on his staff. And from that point, when they get back, World War I is starting. And Pershing sends now Captain Patton over to France to get things going. This tough-looking character is Pershing, and this, young-looking guy is old, George. And here he is over in World War I with the French Renault tank. And his job is to prepare, to get all the base ready, all the supplies, everything the American Expeditionary Force is going to need in World War I. It's a logistics and a planning job. Find a campsite, find training grounds, get all the equipment. Oh my God, this is like a clipboard. This is just not Patton. And he was sniffing around the British and the French tanks, trying to figure out what they were. Pershing finally comes over and he keeps asking for a combat command, asks for a combat command. Finally, Pershing says, okay, you are going to create the American Tank School. You're the only one who knows what this is. I heard you've been sniffing around the British and the French. Here you go. And he goes out to Cambrai, which is the first use of tanks in the world, in a British battle in World War I, and he watches them. And he sees how the infantry leads tanks in, and the tanks are behind them, and the British infantry gets shot to pieces. And Patton says, no, let's flip-flop that. Let the tanks shield the infantry, and the infantry can protect the tanks from, like, mines or bazookas or other explosives. It's a new way of thinking. He will lead tanks in two major battles, in St. Mihiel and in the Battle of Arincourt in World War I in the Meuse-Argonne. On the way to the second one, he passes Douglas MacArthur, who was pinned down, who was wearing his jacket and his famous white scarf and his pipe. He's like, hey, Georgie, can you get rid of those machine guns for me? Yeah, Doug, I'll be right back. And as he starts going, one by one, the French tanks break down. And Patton always told his men, if something breaks down, you grab a rifle and you become an infantryman. And the guys hated it. The problem with Patton is he was always with them. And even back at Fort Bliss, they found him standing in a trench with targets behind him and guys shooting live ammunition all around him. Like, dear God, Patton, what's wrong with you? And he's like, well, how can I lead my men in combat if I'm afraid of sound and noise and getting shot? By the time I get into it, this is going to be normal. And they're like, you're a crazy man. But that's the way he felt. And he is with the tank, and it breaks down, and he jumps out and says, come on, guys, let's go on foot. But Captain, we're tankers. He's like, not anymore. You're soldiers. Grab a rifle. Let's go. And they take out 3 machine gun nests. Everybody in Patton's platoon is killed except a little guy named Joe D'Angelo and Patton. Patton is shot by a machine gun bullet in the right leg. It comes out his right buttock and he's laid up. He finishes World War I on his back, but it ends on his birthday, November 11th. While he's there, he asks to stay and study French command tanks. And he goes all over France. He gets his pilot's license, he flies over it, drives over it, rides a bike over it, and he buys a barn. I may have told some of you this in the World War II class, where he builds a topographical map of northern and central and eastern France. And he would stand there on a ladder just staring at it. And they're like, what are you doing, George? He's like, well, I'm memorizing the map. There's going to be another great war in northwestern Europe, and when it breaks out, I want to be ready. You're stupid. We're never going to have another war. What are you doing this for? And he's like, well, I just want to be ready. It is that map that he memorized that he uses in the Third Army's great run across central France in the spring of 1944. They're saying, George, how do you know what's there? We don't have a map. There aren't any bridges. And he would say, well, remember that map you guys made fun of me for making? If you go down the road and you'll see a white silo, there's a red barn, there's a little stone Roman bridge over the stream. It can hold a tank. That's where I'm at. Like, well, how the hell do you know that, George? Well, I made the map back in 1918. So he gets home. He's assigned to Camp Meade. And his job is to create a tank doctrine. And he gets into a lot of trouble because it's all about speed and aggressiveness. Everyone else put the soldiers in front of the tank. And no. This is the way we're going to do it. And he advocated for bigger, faster, stronger tanks. And nobody would listen except another young little guy named Dwight D. Eisenhower. The two were about in personality as complete opposite as you can get. The very boisterous Patton and the very quiet and academic Eisenhower. But the two get along very well. And when Eisenhower is at the Army War College, when it comes to tank ideas, he writes letters to Patton for advice and then uses what Patton says on a lot of his tests, where he graduates first in his class. So this relationship is going to come back as we get later into World War II. But it's Patton's affluence that really makes people angry. He's at Camp Meade. He decides he's going to go on vacation. A couple of buddies are up in Martha's Vineyard, so he and his wife and kids go up to Martha's Vineyard and they're doing stuff, and they're seeing where the little Kittner boy was eating in the Jaws movie, and you know, they're looking for Quint and all this stuff, and they're going to have a good time. You're like, George, you can't do that. You just because you're rich doesn't mean, he's like, what? I'm on vacation. I can do whatever I want. And the president was there, and there was like champagne and oysters, and they're having a good time. And then a family is out on their little sailboat, and a storm comes up, and the sailboat capsizes. The dad climbs aboard, but he injured himself, and his kids were floundering, and nearly drunk George Patton takes off his tuxedo, jumps into the water, and rescues all 4 kids. All of a sudden, he's a national hero, he gets a life-saving medal, and no one can be mad that George Patton was off having a good time when everyone else was working, because he saves the lives of 4 kids in Martha's Vineyard. So, as a result of that, they send him to Hawaii, 1921. And while he's there, he looks around. I think I told you guys this story in class today, didn't I?
No.
Yes, I did.
No.
I mean, yeah. Where he talks about the assessment of the defenses. Yes, I did. It's all right, Brian. It's all right. You were tuned out. And he looks around and he says, what are you guys doing? All the ships are bow to stern. Going back to the Spanish Armada, it got sunk because all the boats were right next to each other. Spread them out. There's no coastal defenses. There's no anti-aircraft guns. There's no anti-ship guns. No anti-submarine guns. What are you guys doing? They're like, well, George, you can't say that stuff. You're with the Army, not the Navy. He's like, I don't have to be with anybody. It's called brains. Look at this. This is not going to work. And he's like, we need to have a greater eye on the Japanese here in Hawaii. Well, George, you can't say that. It's racist. It's like, what's racist about it? We got spies in Japan. Do you not think that they got spies here? Let's use it on your head. And the General Short, was so angry at him. He goes, you're pointing out all our flaws. That's not your job. You got to get out of here. Patton's like, okay. So he buys a yacht, because he can, and he and his family get on it, and he sails from Hawaii back to San Diego. Now, he had been reading books on navigation, the sextant and the astrolabe, and decided he was going to check it out, and he's going to, now, it's not a small distance from Honolulu back. It's 2,200 miles, and the Pacific's big, and if you don't know what you're doing, who knows where you're going to wind up, but he makes it. And it took him 18 hours longer than he anticipated. He's one of those guys that if he wants to do it, he's going to find a way to get it done. While there, the chief of the Army, chief of staff, is his old buddy Doug MacArthur. He brings Patton to Washington. We're going to work on your tanks when a very sad thing happens. It's in the middle of the Great Depression. And a lot of World War I soldiers were promised a bonus by the United States Army for serving. Well, they never got that bonus. So in the height of the Great Depression, they march on Washington. They were living in the little shanties called Hoovervilles, and they took over the Washington Mall, and it was getting ugly. It was beginning to stink. It was getting nasty. And so MacArthur sent Patton and some cavalry in to break up the Hoovervilles. Patton said he detested the order. So these men were promised something that the government didn't deliver on. But he was a soldier, he was following his orders, and they were soldiers. And as he goes in, and it got kind of rough and nasty here, the only bad thing is, in the midst of the brawl to clear out the former soldiers, he comes face to face with Joe D'Angelo, the only guy to survive the machine gun attack with him. And Joe D'Angelo was a tiny little guy, put Patton on his back, carried him to safety, and saved his life. And Patton says, when I saw Joe, he goes, I almost wanted to break down and cry. I said, Joe, I'm disappointed in you. Get out of here. Patton said he wheeled his horse around and just left. It was like, I can't go through with this anymore because of old Joe. And here is the Patton family getting ready to set sail for San Diego. So, while at Fort Clark, he runs into another influential guy, George C. Marshall, who will be head of the Army when it comes to World War II. And Marshall had this thing, it was literally a little black book. He would write down names in it, and if you were an officer and he liked you, he would keep an eye on you, and he would assign you bizarre little tasks, and if you did them without asking for help and assistance, he made sure you were promoted, and if you didn't, then you were slumped off to the side. Well, there was something about Patton that old Marshall liked, and Patton was aggressively wanting more and more and more tanks. So they set up a couple war games in the South, from Knoxville, Tennessee, down to Shreveport, Louisiana, over to Birmingham, Alabama, and up. And Patton was assigned to what was the blue team. And he follows his general's orders, and his tanks get surrounded and captured, and he loses. And he's angry. And he tells Marshall, you know what? If you guys would have listened to me, I could have won this thing. I could have captured the enemy compound in like 2 days. And like, George, that's just not possible. He's like, yeah, it is. Let's run another war games, turn me loose, let me act on my own, and I'll show you. And the shifty Patton, they kind of do it in the old movie Dirty Dozen. He has blue team armbands when he needs them, but he also has red team armbands when he needs them. And so he begins to run in aggressive circles, large sweeping movements in one direction, feints, and then he cuts and slices a different direction using his tanks in multiple different formations. His speed kind of envelops smaller parts of the defending army, kind of a miniature blitzkrieg, and in 36 hours he captures his opponents not once, but twice. And everyone's mad, God, that Patton did it. Again, God, we hate that guy. Everything he does seems to work. And he's allowed to get away with murder. And Patton will say, well, it's not that none of you can't do what I do or get away with what I do. It's because I'm successful. All right? If you're good at something, you're going to get a little more leeway just because you produce results. So, during this time, he gets his American pilot's license and photographs his army from the air. First one to use aerial reconnaissance, like the 3D image, to understand what is going on. And when people say, George, you're too aggressive, he says, speed saves lives. If you go slow in war, the faster you finish the fight, the faster you conclude the battle, the more American lives are going to be saved. This kind of sets up his eternal battle with Bernard Law Montgomery, who is more of the inchworm approach, or the tortoise, where Patton was the hare. He successfully leads the invasion of North Africa, which was a debacle. He was primarily responsible for it, and he learns many things, like the way they loaded the Navy ships was wrong. The communication was wrong. Oh, not a problem, sir, not a problem. But he wins, and after 3 days, the French surrender, mainly because Patton, when things are stalling out, he was shot with a French ship fired a die marker trying to get a range on the USS Augusta, the ship that Patton was on, and it spits this mustard yellow paint all over him. And his aides are like, oh my God, General Patton, we've got to get you cleaned up. He's like, oh, what the hell for? If the soldiers see me like this, they'll know I'm not afraid to fight. He jumps down in a landing craft and has it driven up to the beach, where he gets his guys who are kind of floundering in the sand in the heavy surf with the incoming tide. He gets them moving forward. They capture a giant fortress known as the Casbah, and they conclude the defeat of the French in Morocco. Not only because of the fighting, but Patton spoke fluent French. His time over there, he loved France, was very, the language, the cooking, and he helps negotiate the armistice with the French forces in Morocco. Then, when that is done, Eisenhower's buddy, General Lloyd Friedenthal, I think I told you about this last week, loses the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It was a disaster. He was well back, 60 miles back of the fighting. All the defenses went to him, and the soldiers up front got chopped to pieces. Eisenhower remembers his old friend Patton and puts him in charge of the 7th Army. And this is where the Patton legend really begins to be born. He rides into camp and he looks around and he says, the reason why we got beat is we're not soldiers. There's no structure, there's no order, there's no discipline. He said, I went through that army like a tornado. I screamed, yelled, cussed, kicked, chewed out, and fined about every soldier I could. And he goes, we didn't have a whole lot of time to train them, so my goal was to make them more afraid of me than they were the Germans. I was going to tighten that group up ASAP. Same group that got its tail whipped at Kasserine Pass goes up against Rommel at El Guitar, or Rommel's plan, and wins our first major victory against real live German troops, the Africa Corps. Not second string Moroccan and French troops, but Germans. And this is, they actually put this in the movie, Patton was angry that his men were getting strafed by German planes, and the British said, you're crazy, there aren't any German planes. And during the meeting, 2 German Luftwaffe bombers begin to blow up the town where Patton is, and Patton jumps out in the street, grabs his .44 and his .45 and is shooting at both the planes as they fire around him. Everyone's going like, George, you're the senior commander, you can't do this. And he goes, if my soldiers see me afraid, then they're going to be afraid. So this is what we need. This is what is going to win. And he begins to preach, we can't wait, because if we wait, the Germans are going to escape. If they get out of North Africa, we're going to have to fight them again. Let's get them before they get to Sicily. Well, the Germans make it out of Tunisia and they get to Sicily. And Patton's like, oh my God, does nobody listen to me around here? So, next up is the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. And this doesn't go well at all. Patton has a plan. It is not followed. Bernard Law Montgomery's plan is followed, and he lands in the town of Syracuse on the west side of Sicily. American soldiers, the 82nd Airborne, is shot to pieces by the Royal Navy. Nothing goes right, and Montgomery's supposed to land 60 miles from Messina. Yes, sir.
Did Churchill have an integral part in planning the invasion, or did he just have the idea to go through Italy?
The idea to go through Italy. All right. Yes, ma'am.
What year are we?
We are in 1942, 43.
Okay.
Yeah, all right. So anyway, I'm sorry. I'm going real fast. I'm sorry. I'll slow down a little bit. All right. I'm getting a little bit too excited. All right. So,
Speed cost lives.
speed, that's right. That's right. Slowness costs lives. That's it, Jansen. You do that. All right. We are now in the spring of 1943, the invasion of Sicily. Montgomery is supposed to go 6 miles up the coast road. It's supposed to take him 2 or 3 days. Patton lands in the south in what is known as the Gulf of Gala. Right in front of him in the Gulf of Gala is Mount Etna, the tallest point of Sicily, and it's where the Germans have built their defensive line. And the terrain is mountainous, the beach isn't very wide. The 82nd Airborne, which was supposed to prepare the invasion route, is shot up or drowned or captured. So when Patton comes ashore, he's getting devastated. They make it, but 2 or 3 days later, Montgomery is still sitting there. He said he was going to go like hell, but he waits till all of his supplies, all of his soldiers, he'll move like 10, 15 miles, stop, and repeat that whole process. And Patton uses this to it wasn't very nice, but it worked. he had his little philosophy of probing. He would radio ahead and say, hey, you know, we're in Chapel Hill, request permission to do a reconnaissance to Carrboro. Yeah, George, go ahead. He would send a couple tanks, and he would say, when you get there, scream, yell, and holler, and say every German in the world is in Carrboro. I will request to move up the army to support you, a request that can't be denied. The guys would get to Carrboro, oh my God, every German is here, what are we going to do? Shooting, screaming, and yelling, and Patton would move his army up. Request permission to do a recon over to Pittsburgh. When you guys get to Pittsburgh, scream, holler, and yell that every German in the world is now in Pittsburgh. And little by little, he breaks off, he goes all the way across Sicily, captures the town of Palermo, and then turns east across the top of the island. Now, he drives his men hard. He fires a couple generals. He screams and yells at Omar Bradley and a guy named Lucian Truscott, who has to do an amphibious landing behind the German lines. But he gets Messina, and he was saying we've got to go fast because if we don't, the Germans are going to escape and we're going to have to fight them again. While he makes it to Messina first, about 300,000 Germans make it over to mainland Italy. He's like, oh my God, it's the second time they got away. He will make a couple of mistakes. This is the famous Patton photo on one of the first Life magazine color photos. And this is him sitting after the Battle of El Guitar, the first major victory. Said he went up there just for a little bit of reflection time because he couldn't articulate how proud he was of the men who in 10 days' time did a complete 180. And yes, ma'am.
Is that his gun right there?
That's his gun right there. That's right down. Then he'll put his 45 like Magnum PI style. You know, I'm like, come on, George, like get like a shoulder holster, man. Is that really necessary? But anyway, so there it is. Now this victory really heightens his rivalry with Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery wanted to get to Messina, but it had taken 2 weeks and he still didn't get there. And so Patton gloats. But the problem is a couple of things. Number one, there are newspaper reporters around when stuck just outside of Messina on the open road when Luftwaffe planes were strafing his column. Patton shoots and kills 2 donkeys. There was a donkey cart on a 1-lane road bridge. His men couldn't get the donkeys moving. He's like, well, for God's sake, we can't stop for 2 donkeys. And he shoots them and pushes the wagon over the bridge. What is not reported is that Patton, out of his own money, bought a new wagon, 2 new donkeys, a cow, and a horse for the farmer. Might not replace what he lost, but he had to get the column moving. That's black mark number 1. And then going into a hospital, he didn't understand post-traumatic stress, shell shock, and there are 2 privates, Charles Call and Paul Bennett. Now, Paul Bennett is the great uncle of former Chapel Hill High School teacher Orman Moore. And he takes his gloves and he slaps the helmets off their heads and says, you will not admit these guys into the hospital. You're going to send them back to the front. I don't care if they get killed, but by God, this is what we are going to do. And reporters see it. And Patton was hailed a hero over in the United States. And then this happens. And the cartoon caricatures get a hold of him, and they draw Patton holding a GI like by his collar, and he has an oversized foot, and on the bottom of his foot is a Nazi swastika.
Oh,
Yeah, and he's like, mother of pearl, blah, 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 blah. So he is forced to apologize to the doctors, to the nurses, to the 2 soldiers, and the entire 7th Army. And a guy with the pride and ego of Patton, that really had to hurt. Everybody wanted him sacked. But here is where the kind of good old boy network saves him. Number 1, his head boss in Europe is Eisenhower. He also has a good buddy in George C. Marshall. And they're like, look, George is a wild card. We know this. But very few people in the world can do what he can. So we're going to punish him, but don't force him to resign. So over the next year, Patton will be flown all over the Mediterranean. He will be given VIP tours to senators, to congressmen, the Punic War battle here. This is where Mark Antony was defeated over here. Julius Caesar did this. Charlemagne did that. He's a military tour guide. And everywhere he moves, the Germans deviate large numbers of forces. They're pulled from fighting in Italy. They're pulled from reinforcing the Norman coast. They're pulled from the failing Battle of Stalingrad and Kursk because the Germans believe Patton is going to lead the invasion. Patton has no idea he's being used as a decoy. They've really got to teach him a lesson. And Patton also, bizarrely, believed that his spirit was a warrior spirit throughout time, and whenever true evil existed on the earth, he was reincarnated to do battle against true evil. And he would tell you, well, I was with Napoleon in Russia, or I was with, Hannibal crossing the Alps. Like, well, George, you're saying that as if you were really there. And he would say, but I was. Yes, ma'am.
At what point in his career did he start making that known to people? When did he start talking
West
about
Point, when he was a cadet. Okay, George, did you sneak off campus and, drink too much Hudson water? Like, what's going on with you? Because they're like, oh, and he even writes a poem. Its title is The Soldier Through the Glass and Darkly, where he describes, this is where I've been and this is what I've done. They're like, okay, George, all right, you're the man. Anyway, interesting. One of those interesting guys to have like dinner with and be like, is he really that crazy and that weird, or was it all? He has some showmanship. I mean, definitely.
We can still do it, right?
What's that?
He's still around.
He's still around. I mean, I don't know who he is right now, but we're, we'll have to find. Let's see. I don't.
Zach Allen. He's definitely Zach Allen.
He's dead.
Yeah, we'll see. Ryan Kleisler? I don't know. We don't know. 1944, he's sent into the Battle of Normandy, and he begins that great run across France. And his men, if you talk to them, many of them just loved him. We hated him at first, but man, after we got going, we figured out what it was. They have this really undying devotion to him, or the small minority just can't stand him. But most of his guys are just Patton disciples through and through. But what is not talked about is Patton is this larger-than-life ego, but what people don't talk about is his flexibility and his adaptability in combat. What other people scoffed at, he would say, no, that's the next evolution in military combat. The Germans have been doing that since 1936. He is the first one to work with General Pete Quesada on aerial bombing. Combined arm support. My tankers will talk to you up in the airplanes. Well, George, aren't you afraid some of your tankers are going to get hit? Or aren't you afraid that that's going to detract from your arm? He's like, the Army's job is to win. Whatever resource I have at my disposal, I don't care. So he begins to work with Pete Quesada on combined infantry, tank, and aerial support. He always tells his guys, you have my authority. If you see something, if you see an opening to exploit it, go for it. All right? A different way to attack a hedgerow, a way to attack, a German-held town or fortification. Be flexible, be adaptable. Don't do the same thing every time, or the Germans are going to pick up on it. That is what I want you to do. What works, let me know. We'll write it down, and we will disseminate it to everybody else. What I want is speed, speed, and speed. Once again, he wants to surround the Germans at the Falaise Gap. He is told to stop, and he's like, dear God, if we don't finish this, they're going to escape again. Which the Germans do, and they make it back to the Siegfried line. But he says, guys, I keep telling you, sooner or later, you're going to realize that I am correct. So, during the Battle of the Bulge, he will see what is happening and deviate a third of his army about 36 hours before anybody else realized what was going on. And when he meets with Eisenhower at Verdun, and Eisenhower says, George, how fast can we get your Third Army up to Bastogne? He says, well, 48 hours. George, there's no way, it's over 100 miles. He's like, well, we started about 36 hours ago. Ike, we got this. Now, he used the old red and blue trick. Omar Bradley's First Army was supposed to get the bulk of the gas. Patton had his men fabricate some First Army patches and armbands and credentials, and they go in and they steal Omar Bradley's gas. Bradley was incensed, but Patton's like, well, I got to Bastogne, so sorry, Omar. It's called war. Anyway.
What was Omar? He wasn't a 5-star then, was he?
No, he was only a 3. He was Patton's boss.
Okay.
But still, like
So
George
outranked him, yeah.
outranked him. You stole my stuff. Well, yeah, I
Yeah.
did, but this is how we're going to do it. Patton's forces going through France, kill and wound 99,000 and capture 140,000. There's only so much you can say when your general is producing results. But Patton's ego gets a little carried away when he sends 345 guys to break his son-in-law out of a POW camp. It's about 50 miles behind enemy lines. It's a horrible debacle. Only 35 of the guys he sends actually make it back. Most of them are captured. They're not killed. It is something the War Department tries to suppress. Patton uses his authority to try and save his son-in-law, who gets shot as the American tankers were coming to let him out of the camp. He goes out to try and negotiate a ceasefire, and the Germans shoot him. So the whole thing did not work out at all. He is the first to cross the Rhine at the Remagen Bridge. And since the Normandy campaign, his army was in frontline combat for 281 days. The only break they got was a 17-day stretch during Operation Market Garden, which Patton didn't want to stop during. They captured 12,000 cities and towns, crossed 24 rivers, and 1,800,000 German soldiers are killed, captured, or wounded 6 times the strength of Patton's Third Army. When you compare Patton's numbers with those of the German records, they're only off by a few thousand, so they're about spot on. Here's Patton. This is when he pees in the Rhine River. He got up and drank a couple pitchers of water and a pot of coffee. He goes, I really want to be good and full, and this is what I think of Germany, much to the delight of his guys. And when it's over, he's made the military dictator of Bavaria, a job that he hates. But while there, he again uses his authority. He secrets out the famous Lipperzahner stallions after riding them, and he is approached by a German Luftwaffe captain who says, look, I got 10 of these things. They are in the Russian sector. What would you like me to do with them? And Patton orders him to fly 10 Messerschmitt 262 twin jet fighters over to France and then to London to get them out of Soviet hands so we can understand and study rocket fuel technology and the jet fighter aircraft. He hated being a governor, and he was always saying things like, you probably know, getting him like, let's rearm the Nazis and go fight the Soviets, tell MacArthur to pick me up and Irkutsk in 10 days, I'll be there and blow through the Soviets. Like, oh God, George, you can't say those things. He's like, well, everyone's thinking it, I'm just the one saying it. And he's given the task of writing the history of World War II in Europe, something that everyone thinks that he will get into, and it's briefly interesting, and then he gets bored. So he's invited to go